From the Toronto Star, I'm Raji Munder, and this matters. The thing about seeing the light at the end of the tunnel is that you still have no idea how much farther you still have to go. While the arrival of vaccines have been touted as the bright spot on the COVID-19 horizon, it seems getting those shots into people's arms is not going as smoothly as hoped. From manufacturer delays, queue jumping, and some controversial rollout decisions, many factors are at play. A perfect example is in Toronto, where on the weekend, Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Ford were on hand at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre unveiling it as a vaccine clinic site, only to now have it shut down and sit empty as we all wait for more vaccine supply. To discuss what's happening with vaccine delays and deliveries and some of the other COVID-19 medicines we are still waiting for, we are joined by Alex Boyd, a Calgary-based reporter for The Star who has been on the vaccine beat. Alex, thank you so much for being with us again today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Alex, rising case numbers, the vaccines are the light at the end of the tunnel, but we've already started to hit some road bumps. Let's just set the stage right now. And so far, we have 2 vaccines that have been approved in Canada, right? But there have been some issues in the rollout so far and getting them into people. What can you tell us about that right now?
Right. So you're correct. There are 2 vaccines that are now approved for use in Canada. They've been rolling out. I think it's important to not lose sight of the fact that this is, a pretty big slam dunk for science. I don't know if you're aware, but on Monday, Canada actually will hit a little bit of a milestone. That's January 25th. So it'll have been exactly 1 year since the first presumed coronavirus case was detected here in the country. So the fact that we're even talking about vaccines at all with inside of a year since that happened, really is a big win for the researchers that have been working very hard on this. But like you say, rollout has been a little bit challenging. Transportation, as we've talked about on this podcast before, has been a big one. Pfizer is the one that requires that now infamous super cold temperatures to transport. They've been kind of making their way around the country in these special thermal shippers packed with dry ice. Speed, of course, has been an issue. And we've seen kind of the feds and the provinces, busily pointing fingers at each other here. But I think it's fair comment to say that some of these, provincial programs have been slow to scale up. Even right now, only just over 80% of the vaccines that have been delivered in the country have made their way into arms. And of course, this is Canada. Each province is in charge of their own rollout. So we're starting to see some differences emerge between the provinces, places like in Alberta and Ontario who've managed to move quite a bit of their vaccine doses proportionally versus other places, the north, parts of the Maritimes that have been a little bit slower. And then, of course, who to give them to has been an ongoing debate, which is not unexpected. There's not, one single magic answer to this. Who's most vulnerable? Should it be long-term care residents? Should it be healthcare workers? This is something that really matters to people. And so we're starting to see a lot of debate here emerge as well. So which is to say, it's great that we've got vaccines, but there have been some speed bumps.
Regarding those speed bumps, there's been stories about depleted supplies, queue jumping, other issues. The other question right now is, do you think that health officials or politicians are recalibrating this rollout due to these initial controversies?
I do think we're seeing them responding to some of this. I think we're seeing tweaks being made to some of these plans. I don't know if I'd necessarily call it recalibrating so much as, calibrating as we go. This has happened very fast. And I think, the whole vaccine effort really has been kind of characterized by this is happening very quickly. We're figuring this out as we go. Some of this is just kind of people responding to what's going on, trying to figure out the best way to do this. Pfizer, of course, was approved almost 6 weeks ago, which was that big flashing green light for everyone to kind of jump into distribution mode. But it's a big task that they're faced with. And I think certainly some things really have gone better. I think there's some fair criticisms of the speed. We're seeing questions in Toronto, for example, about why hospital executives in some cases are getting shots on the front line. But some of this, I think is just kind of learning as we go. We've seen some of these programs off to a relatively slow start in terms of getting vaccine doses out the door. But, they're starting to scale up a little bit. So we are seeing kind of adaptations to who's getting it, how fast these things are happening, those sorts of things. That said, I think leaders are quite fairly feeling the pressure on this. We heard from Ontario Premier Doug Ford this morning, calling on President-elect Biden to send 1 million doses from the US, which seems unlikely to me, but I guess you got to shoot your shot. But I do think leaders are really feeling the pressure here.
Shooting your shot is a very nice way of putting what seemed like a fairly ludicrous request. But that's just me talking. Anyways,
I'm not sure we're going to be seeing vaccines there.
I'm all for Doug Ford doing whatever we can, but I thought that was a bit of a long shot there. The clear indication here is that we all have to wait. And now everybody in the world who is waiting for these things. And right now, the big news is that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has announced that there will be a drop in shipments for the next month or so. Can you explain what that's all about?
Yes. So this was a big bombshell that Pfizer dropped on us, dropped on a few other countries on Friday. And so what's going on, they say, is they're upgrading their factory in Belgium. And it turns out that this is the factory that was making the doses that were coming to Canada, that were coming to large parts of Europe. Interestingly, they have a different factory in the US, which is why the US is not affected by this. And President-elect Biden, may or may not have some extra vaccines, arguably. So what they told us was that shipments over the next month would be about half of what we expected. And this is already upending vaccination programs across the country and really concerning people who want to see these doses getting out to people in Canada as fast as they can. We got some new news, which is also not fantastic. We heard from Major General Fortin, who is, of course, the gentleman here in Canada who's in charge of vaccine rollout, who said he was told by Pfizer that we will not be getting any shipments at all next week. So this obviously compounds the issue. We're going to see a drop in the number of doses that people around the country are going to be able to administer next week. And that's something that's really concerning, I think, to a lot of people. And then, of course, this is something that the entire world is trying to get their hands on. And so we're starting to see some geopolitical tensions play out here a little bit. We've been told that we're going to have to wait a month for our vaccine shipments to go back up again. Leaders in Europe were apparently told the same thing. They were reportedly very angry about this. And so they called Pfizer, they got on the phone, and their shipments apparently are now going to be going up to what was expected or closer to what was expected a little bit sooner. And so now this has also raised questions here in Canada about why they seem to be getting a little bit better treatment than we are here. So, I think a lot of questions about how this is going to play out over the next month. Like you say, case counts are rising. It's a very critical time for people to be protected. So this is, not great news.
It's not great news. Canada's strategy around this was to buy a bunch of vaccines, and obviously many more times that are necessary for our population. How is that strategy playing out, considering we've only approved 2, there are more in the pipeline and still more in development? I mean, is this one of these things where because it's first, the growing pains are now and may perhaps would be smoothed out as time goes by? But again, how do those other vaccines that are in development or also potentially being approved, how does that come into play into this?
So you're right. Like for as long as we've been thinking about vaccines, which again is less than a year, then, oh gosh, it's been a long year. Experts have really been looking at this as we really need to have, or ideally we would have a portfolio of vaccines that work here. This wasn't a case of them saying, let's get one vaccine that works and then, go home and call it a day. And the reason for that is that, this is going to be an incredibly in-demand product. Until recently, we didn't have any idea of which ones would work or if they would work. And particularly in a place like Canada, where we don't have the ability to make our own vaccines. And according to the experts that I spoke to, by the time the pandemic started, the horse was out of the barn. We didn't really have time to build that capacity. It was really critical that we lock down agreements with different companies so that assuming, one of these turned out to be effective or more than one turned out to be effective, that Canada had access to these doses. And so Canada currently has agreements for 7 different vaccines. We've, of course, seen 2 of these be approved and become available to Canadians. But I've talked to a few of the people who are on what's called the Vaccine Task Force. So this was the panel of experts who were tasked with vetting the science, vetting the manufacturing plans, vetting the companies themselves and telling Canada, hey, we think these are the vaccines that you should bet on. And one thing that they've really said was that it was important to them that they had a diverse portfolio of vaccines. And so part of that was getting a selection of what's called platform, which is the way in which you approach making the vaccines. And so I think it's probably worth pointing out that the first 2 to be approved, both Pfizer and Moderna, are using the same platforms. They're using what's called mRNA, which is a new technology, but it allows you to create a vaccine a little bit faster. And so, that gave them the advantage in terms of getting across that finish line sooner. But as we start to see some of these other vaccines, come through clinical testing, start applying for regulatory approval, it's possible that they might be effective in different groups. They might be cheaper. They might be easier to transport. These are questions we don't necessarily have answers to yet, but the hope is that eventually we'll have a bunch of different vaccines and healthcare providers will be able to have, a larger supply, but then also hopefully be able to match some of these vaccines to specific populations based on which vaccine does what the best.
We'll be right back. You did a great piece that put us in the sort of the horse race of where some of these others are. Now, I believe you mentioned there are two that are in the Health Canada approval process, right? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Correct. Yes. So there are two that have already applied to Health Canada. Health Canada scientists, hopefully as we speak, are going through that information and trying to come to some sort of conclusion. The first one that observers say, and we've heard from the health minister as well, is likely to reach a decision probably the soonest, is the vaccine made by a British-Swedish pharmaceutical company called AstraZeneca. They've partnered with the University of Oxford. And so this vaccine, has long been considered one of the front runners. It's expected to be cheaper. The company has said they will not profit off it while the pandemic is ongoing. It's expected to be easier to distribute, which bodes well for more remote places in Canada, for the developing world. But it's not been without controversy. They've had some questions raised about their dosing regime. When they were doing their clinical testing, they planned to give all their volunteers 2 doses of the full dose of their vaccine. But it came out later that someone made a mistake and some of their volunteers got a smaller dose for their first shot. And it turned out that this might have been a happy mistake. It turned out that there are some results to suggest that the vaccine was actually more effective when administered in this way. But it's raised questions about why this mistake was made, how it was made public, whether there's enough information about which dose to use. And so while this vaccine, has been approved in the United Kingdom, there are some questions there. So I think it's probably fair comment to say that, this is one of the issues that Health Canada, is currently working through. So that's a dose that we expect to see a decision on relatively soon. The other one that's in the pipeline, it's made by a company called Janssen. So they're the pharmaceutical arm of Johnson & Johnson. This is the only vaccine that Canada is betting on that would require just 1 dose. So that could be obviously a bit of a game changer if it turns out to be effective. But at this point, all we've seen is early results, which show that it produces some sort of immune response. It doesn't seem to have huge side effects, but we're expecting, more detailed results on that potentially later this month or early next.
Can you tell me a little bit about Medicago, which is the Canadian, potentially homegrown candidate? Am I saying that correctly? Medicago?
You are. Medicago. They're an interesting one. So this is one of the, like I say, the 7 vaccines that Canada has backed, but it's the only one that's made in Canada, which is kind of neat. They're based in Quebec. The other thing that's kind of interesting about them is that they're using plants to make their vaccines. So instead of, trying to grow, viruses or pieces of it in the lab, they're using what is essentially a cousin of a tobacco plant to grow virus-like particles, which are tiny little bits that are designed to trick your immune system into thinking that they're the virus. They're not the virus. They can't affect you. They can't make you sick. But the hope is that they trick your immune system into thinking that they're the virus and teach it to produce an immune response so that it can fight off the coronavirus if it is later exposed. And so they're hard at work on this. They're currently enrolling volunteers for a phase 2, phase 3 trial. So they're kind of starting to get towards, the later stages of human testing. They have got quite a bit of federal investment. They've got $173 million in federal dollars, which would get us up to 76 million doses if they prove successful. They also are building a manufacturing facility in Quebec City. So we'd have some manufacturing ability here at home as well. So they're an interesting one. And just, for the sake of us here in Canada, going to be an interesting one to watch.
Can you smoke it?
You know what? I asked them, you can't. It's a cousin of a tobacco plant, but you cannot make cigarettes out of it. They were very clear on that point.
I'm sorry, I just begged the question.
Of course.
I'm trying to find some humor in this because honestly, I think the key here, Alex, is that we're all waiting. What do we know about timelines right now, at least with the vaccines that are delayed, and then just all timelines? What can you tell us? How long do you think we're going to be waiting?
Right. So all I can kind of tell you at this point is what federal officials are telling us. And so what we heard from them again this morning is that even with the delays we're seeing from Pfizer, they remain optimistic that we will have caught up by the end of March. And so the agreement all along was that we would get 4 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, in addition to the 2 million Moderna vaccine doses by the end of March. And so even though we're getting none next week, we're going to get, fewer shipments over the next month or so. Apparently, Pfizer has assured them that they will be scaling up after that, and we will be all caught up by the end of March. So, if this whole episode has taught us nothing, it's that there can be issues here. And so this is what they're telling us now. Definitely something to keep an eye on. As well, they have reiterated that their deadline is to make sure that everyone in Canada who wants a vaccine is able to get one by the end of September. And so they are sticking with that deadline that, the general population will start to have access to it starting this summer. And they are still aiming for that goal of end of September. So even though, this isn't great news, they seem to be sticking with those original deadlines. And so, I think it's a reason for hope, but also something for people to keep an eye on and really see if that ends up being the case.
Alex, I know you've been following this very, very closely. Is there anything that's really stuck out to you in sort of the vaccine rollout in Canada, and for any reason?
I don't know if it's the rollout in Canada per se, but one thing I have been watching as someone who has been writing about this for a while now is the rollout around the world. And I absolutely understand why Canadians want to get the vaccine. It is our job to hold the government to account and make sure that we're getting it as soon as possible. I personally would love to see a vaccine, but I think it's also important to keep an eye on our global neighbors, how this is rolling out around the world. And what we're seeing right now is most of the vaccine going to countries who can afford it. And there are many countries around the world who have a lot of active COVID cases, who don't have a lot of health infrastructure, who aren't getting vaccine and won't even get a vaccine this year, possibly based on how it's rolling around the world. So in as much as, it's so important that a vaccine is making its way to vulnerable Canadians, I think it's also a fair comment that people can also keep an eye out for our global neighbors.
I think this is an excellent point, and it's one of the things I mentioned to you. I believe there was a World Health Organization report saying that 25 doses had been given to the 40 poorest countries at this point. We can be upset that we're missing some here, but really that puts the whole thing in a little bit of perspective, I think. And also, we do need to vaccinate everybody around the world for all of our sakes, right? Just want to say, this has been fantastic for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know?
A really great point that I heard from McGill epidemiologist Nicole Basta that didn't make it into my story, but I thought was a great point. She really reiterated that, vaccination is our only way out of this pandemic. If you don't like living under lockdown, this is something that you're going to need to consider. And the day is coming when all of us will get to make this choice. And so we all really, she argues, have an obligation to learn about the vaccines, to kind of understand how they work, whether this is something that you're comfortable with, so that when that day comes, you're prepared to make that decision.
Well, I can tell you, I've already got my sleeve rolled up. Quite honestly, I can't wait to drop my parents off to get their shot, whenever that might be. Alex, I really, really want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Alex Boyd is a Calgary-based reporter from The Star who is covering vaccines. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajin Buddher, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.